In the quiet town of Ashwood, a young woman named Evangeline inherits her grandmother's old, creaky house. As she settles in, she discovers a series of unsettling letters addressed to her, each revealing dark family secrets and hinting at a sinister presence watching her every move. The more she uncovers, the more her reality unravels, blurring the line between sanity and madness. Will Evangeline escape the haunting grip of her family's past, or will she become another lost soul within the house's walls? If you've ever stepped into a house that felt just a little too quiet, a little too still, then you'll know exactly the kind of quiet I'm talking about. It's not peace, it's not calm. It's that kind of silence where you can hear the weight of the air pressing down on everything, the faint creaks of old wood settling like something unseen, shifting Jay. That was the kind of quiet that greeted Evangeline the moment she stepped into her gra. She hadn't been back to Ashwood in over 10 years, not since she was a child chasing fireflies in the backyard. But life has a way of pulling you back to places you swore you'd never return. Her grandmother, Edith Halloway, had passed away just 2 weeks prior, and to everyone's surprise, the old woman had left her house to Evangeline. Not her parents, not her the house stood at the end of a long, cracked driveway lined with skeletal trees. It was old, really old. Weight of her suitcase wheels thudded against the uneven floorboards. Dust motes swirled in the faint light seeping through lace curtains, making everything look washed out and grey. The smell hit her next, a mixture of old wood, mothballs, and something faintly sweet but rotten, like fruit left too long in a drawer. She wrinkled her "No, home sweet home," but no one answered. Of course not. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and lined with faded family portraits. She glanced at them as she passed. They'd always creeped her out as a kid, those stiff, unsmiling faces staring out from frames too large for the pictures they held. Her grandmother had a thing for old family photos, even if half the people in them had been dead for decades. Evangeline paused in front of one, a young girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and eyes dark as coal. Her name was handwritten at the bottom in looping script, Amara, 1894. The girl's eyes were just a little too sharp. They followed you no matter where you stood. With a shiver, Evangeline turned away and made her way to the kitchen. It looked almost exactly as she remembered. The same scuffed table, the same chipped ceramic rooster clock on the wall, its hands stuck forever at 3:12. She ran a finger along the countertop, leaving a trail through the dust. How long had it been since anyone really lived here? Her grandmother's caretaker had only come by once a week toward the end, and it showed. She sighed, glancing at the papers the lawyer had given her. Deeds, notices, instructions for selling the house. Her parents had urged her to do just that. Sell it and be done with it, Evie. There's no reason to stay in that old place, but she wasn't sure why she hesitated. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe it was guilt. Her grandmother had always loved her in that quiet, distant way that older people love children who remind them of themselves. Maybe this house was her grandmother's way of passing something on. Or maybe it was just a burden disguised as a gift. Later that evening, Evangeline unpacked her things in the upstairs bedroom. It was the same one she'd slept in as a child, the one with the slanted ceiling and the old dollhouse sitting in the corner. She hated that dollhouse. It was too perfect, too still. She remembered how, as a child, she'd sometimes wake up and swear the tiny chairs had moved, or the miniature front door had been left open when she knew she'd closed it. Kids' imaginations, she told herself now. But even adults know there's a difference between imagination and instinct. By midnight, she was already regretting her decision to stay. The sound started around 12:43 a.m. It was subtle at first. A faint tap, tap, tap from the wall behind her bed. She opened her eyes, blinking up at the ceiling, listening. Mice, she thought, just mice in the walls. But the tapping didn't scurry. It didn't stop and start like tiny feet. It was rhythmic, steady. Tap, 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 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. She sat up, eyes straining in the darkness. The old house creaked, the wind howled softly outside, but the knocking stayed. Tap, 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 right behind the wall. Probably pipes, she whispered, her breath fogging the cold air. Old houses make noise, it's nothing. She laid back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, heart thudding a little faster than before. She squeezed her eyes shut, counting her breaths. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped open. It was louder this time. Nope, she muttered, sitting up and flicking on the bedside lamp. Yellow light flooded the room, making everything seem less threatening. She stared at the wall where the tapping had come from, half expecting to see cracks or holes. But there was nothing. Just faded blue wallpaper, peeling in one corner like old skin. With a sigh, she lay back down, forcing herself to relax. Just mice, just pipes, just an old house creaking. Nothing more. But it took a long time for sleep to find her again. The next morning, she found something strange. It was small, almost insignificant, but things like that always are at first. On the kitchen table was an envelope. It hadn't been there the night before. She was sure of it. It was yellowed with age, like old parchment, and sealed with dark red wax in the shape of an unfamiliar symbol. A circle with 3 sharp lines running through it like claw marks. Her heart did a slow, uneasy turn in her chest. She stared at it for a full minute before touching it. Her fingers hovered over the wax seal. Her first instinct was to leave it alone, but instinct has a funny way of being ignored when curiosity takes over. She cracked it open. The paper inside was brittle, the ink faded but legible. It wasn't long, only 5 words, written in sharp, hurried strokes. I see you. Do you? Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the room like she'd just woken up in a stranger's house. The weight of that quiet air was back, pressing down hard on her shoulders, thick enough to choke on. Someone's watching me, her mind whispered. Her eyes darted to the window, the door, the hallway beyond, but no one was there. Okay, she said aloud, like that could somehow make it less terrifying. Okay, it's probably just some old letter she kept around. Nothing to freak out about. But as she turned the letter over, she froze. On the back of the paper, in the same sharp handwriting, was something new. Fresh ink. Fresh strokes. Not faded like the front. It said, "You're alone now, Evie." Her blood turned cold. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, her breath coming shallow and fast. She backed away slowly, keeping her eyes on the hall. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. "Is anyone here?" Silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. No, this silence was different. This silence was listening. Evangeline didn't sleep that night. She stayed on the couch in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with every light in the house on. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button more times than she cared to admit. But what would she even say? That she got a creepy letter and heard some knocking. The police would laugh, tell her it's the house settling and move on. "It's fine," she whispered to herself, eyes darting to every shadow that stretched too long or flickered too sharply. "Just nerves. Old house. Nerves." But her breath stayed shallow and her ears stayed sharp, tuned for any sound out of place. By 3 a.m., exhaustion won. Her eyes grew heavy and eventually she drifted into a restless sleep. The dream came quickly. She was walking down the narrow hallway lined with those old family portraits. But in the dream, it wasn't dusty or dim. The hallway glowed with a soft golden light, like the warm haze of a summer evening. She walked slowly, her feet bare against the cool wooden floor. But something was off. The pictures were wrong. In each frame, the faces of her relatives were different, not just different, watching her. Their heads, once stiff and still, were now tilted, eyes locked onto her with quiet, unsettling focus. She walked faster, heart pounding harder with each step. The girl in the portrait labeled Amara 1894 had her face pressed against the glass, her dark eyes wide and her mouth curled into a too-sharp smile. Evangeline's steps quickened into a jog, then a sprint. At the end of the hall was a door she didn't remember ever being there. It was painted the same blue as the wallpaper, so well camouflaged she might never have noticed it if it weren't for the faint glow of red light bleeding out from the cracks. She didn't want to open it, but her hand was already reaching for the knob, fingers curling around the cold brass before she even realized what she was doing. As soon as she turned it, something on the other side pushed back. Not hard, just enough for her to feel it. A hand, a palm pressed against the door from the other side, meeting her own touch perfectly. Her heart slammed in her chest and she gasped, pulling her hand away as if she'd been burned. The hand on the other side didn't pull away. It pressed harder, flattening against the wood, fingers splayed. She could hear it breathing. It was breathing right on the other side. Her own breath hitched in terror, her body locked in place. Then slowly, the fingers curled, dragging downward, nails scraping the wood with a sound like knives on bone. The scraping stopped. Then 3 sharp knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes snapped open, breathless and sweating, heart pounding like a drum. She sat up, clutching her chest. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming, but her eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the living room. The air felt heavy, thick, like it was stuffed with cotton. Her phone buzzed on the couch cushion next to her, and she jumped, nearly screaming. It was a notification, just a weather alert. Rain tomorrow. She let out a shaky breath and laughed under it. But the laugh died in her throat when she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Her whole body went rigid. It wasn't a dream, it was here. The knock came from the front door this time. 3 sharp, precise taps, not frantic, not hesitant, patient, like whoever was on the other side had all the time in the world to wait. Who is it? She called, her voice cracking halfway through. No answer. She didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the door, the old brass doorknob that hadn't turned, not yet anyway. Her heart was pounding so hard she swore whoever was on the other side could hear it. She reached slowly for her phone, fingers trembling as she unlocked it. She pulled up the dial pad, ready to call for help. But then, a voice. A voice came from the other side of the door, low, rasping, like a whisper spoken too close to a microphone. Evie. It crooned softly, almost like a lullaby. You left the door unlocked. Her blood went ice cold. She slapped her hand over her mouth, holding her breath like it might make her invisible. Her eyes darted to the door. No, I locked it, I know I did. But the voice on the other side chuckled softly, like it could hear her thoughts. Come open it, Evie, it whispered again, playful and sweet, like a parent calling a child in for dinner. Her lungs burned, but she didn't dare breathe. She kept her eyes locked on the knob, praying it wouldn't move. For a long, aching minute, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Maybe whoever it was had left. Then the doorknob turned, slowly, quietly. Metal scraping against metal. She shot off the couch, sprinting to the hallway, her feet slamming the floor harder than she meant. She ran into the kitchen and grabbed the first thing she could find, a knife from the drawer. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She crouched behind the kitchen counter, heart slamming against her ribs like it was trying to break free from her chest. The house was silent again. No knocks, no voices, no turning doorknob. She stayed there for what felt like hours, heart thundering, blade clenched tight in her hand. Her fingers hurt from gripping it so hard. Her eyes were locked on the hallway, the narrow corridor that led back to the front door. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. Eventually, the sun rose, and with it came a fragile sense of safety. The world outside was painted in soft grey-blue light, and for the first time in hours, Evangeline dared to stand. Her legs ached, her feet were sore from pressing into the hardwood floor. She moved slowly, knife still in hand, walking toward the front door. Her pulse raced with every step. The door was closed. The doorknob was still. She placed her hand on the lock, testing it, and nearly burst into tears when she felt it turn freely. It was unlocked. Her knees gave out, and she slid to the floor, covering her face with her hands. No, I locked it. I know I did. She sat there, shaking, rocking back and forth in the dim light. The only sound was the soft creak of the house settling. But her mind was louder. How did it know my name? How did it know? She ran her fingers through her hair, tugging hard, trying to ground herself. Call the police. Call them now. Her phone was still on the couch. Her eyes flicked to it. Then her heart stopped. The phone wasn't on the couch anymore. It was on the floor, halfway between her and the front door, face down. She would have heard it fall. She would have heard it fall. Her breathing grew fast and sharp, chest rising and falling like she'd just run a marathon. Slowly, she stood up, her knees weak, every nerve on fire. Her eyes stayed on the phone, like it might move on its own. Don't move! Don't you dare move! Her mouth was dry as ash. Then the phone vibrated. It buzzed once, twice, then stopped. A new message. Her phone screen lit up. One new message. Her eyes flicked to the door, to the phone, then back to the door. She moved slowly toward the phone, crouching down, muscles tense like a coiled spring. She picked it up, hands slick with sweat. The message was from an unknown number. No name, no contact, just 3 words. Don't look up. Her breath caught in her chest. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the phone, but it was too late. Her eyes flicked up. She saw it. A face, pale, hollow, upside down, hanging just above the doorway. It smiled. Her scream caught in her throat, not because she didn't want to scream, but because she couldn't. Her chest heaved with the effort, lungs straining, but no sound came. Her body went stiff, every muscle locked in place as she stared at it. The face was inches from the ceiling, hanging upside down, hollow eyes fixed directly on hers. Its grin was too wide, lips pulled back over teeth that were too sharp, too jagged, like splintered bone. The face didn't move, it just stared, watching, waiting. Her breath came in short, frantic bursts as her eyes darted to the doorway. Run, run now, move your legs, move. But her legs refused to listen. Her fingers felt numb, still clutching the phone so tightly it hurt. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and denial, a scream trapped on a broken loop inside her head. This isn't real, it's not real, it's not real. Then it moved, not like a person. No, it didn't climb down, it didn't crawl, it dropped. Straight down like dead weight, landing on its hands and feet in one horrible, unnatural motion. The thud of it hitting the floor echoed through the house. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt loud. Like the air itself had recoiled. Her whole body jerked back, and this time she finally found her voice. She screamed. It didn't rush at her. It didn't lunge. It just stood there, crouched low to the ground, its head tilted so sharply to one side it looked broken. The hollow eyes stared at her, that smile still there, like it had been carved into its face. It shifted, just slightly, one hand scraping the floor as its head tilted the other way, watching her, studying her, like a predator measuring how much fun it could have before the kill. "Stay away!" she gasped, swinging the kitchen knife out in front of her. "Stay back!" Her voice was hoarse and cracked, terror bleeding into every word. It didn't move. Her chest heaved, each breath harder than the last. Her eyes flicked around the kitchen, searching for a way out. There were no back doors, no windows big enough to climb through. She was trapped with it. Then It spoke, not with a mouth. Its mouth didn't move. It stayed fixed in that same grin. But the words came anyway, like they were being spoken right inside her head. "Why are you scared, Evie?" it rasped, its voice like dry leaves crumbling underfoot. The tone was playful, amused, like it already knew the answer but wanted to hear her say it. "Don't you remember me?" Her eyes widened, her breath hitched. "No, no, 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 it's lying, it's lying! I don't know you!" she shouted, gripping the knife with both hands now, her arms trembling. "I don't know you!" Its smile widened, impossibly wide. Her breath caught in her chest as the corners of its mouth split open, flesh peeling back like paper, stretching its grin to the very edges of its face. Its hollow eyes locked on hers, unblinking, full of something ancient and knowing. "That's not true, little girl," it crooned, its head tilting to the other side with a sickening pop. "You played with me once, long ago. You just don't remember." Her stomach twisted into a knot. She shook her head violently, tears blurring her vision. Shut up, you're not real, you're not real." Her words were frantic, more for herself than for it. Her breathing was too fast, her heart on the verge of bursting. "You used to call me friend," it hissed, dragging its clawed fingers slowly across the floor, each scrape a needle to her nerves. "You whispered secrets to me, in the dark, by the dollhouse." Her heart stopped. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the kitchen. Her childhood memories felt like fragments of broken glass, jagged and unclear, but now something sharp and cold crept into her mind. The dollhouse. Her throat tightened. No, 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 that was just a game. It was just a game. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't leave the dollhouse open at night, Evangeline. If you leave it open, things can come in." Her eyes darted to the doorway, heart pounding like thunder. Run, run, now. But it was still there, crouched between her and the exit. It raised one hand slowly, and for a moment she thought it was going to lunge. But it didn't. It waved, slow, deliberate, a mockery of friendliness. "Welcome home, Evie," it whispered, and its voice was suddenly everywhere. In the walls, in the floor, in her bones. "We've been waiting for you." She bolted. She didn't think. Her feet moved on instinct, legs driving her forward as her mind screamed, "Don't look back. Don't you dare look back." She dashed for the staircase, her socks skidding on the hardwood floor. Her chest ached from the cold, sharp air she gulped down. Behind her, she heard it move, fast. Not the heavy thud of feet, but the sharp, skittering scrape of nails on wood. She heard it scramble up the walls across the ceiling, its weight shifting above her as she ran. Her mind shattered with panic. Her legs felt like jelly, but she didn't stop. "Don't look back, don't look back, don't look back." She hit the stairs, taking them two at a time. Her ankle twisted on the third step and she nearly fell, her hands slamming against the wall to keep herself upright. She felt it behind her. Too close. It's too close. Her breath came in ragged sobs as she hit the top of the stairs. She shot down the hallway, heart racing, legs burning. She darted into her bedroom, slamming the door behind her, twisting the lock as fast as she could. She pressed her back against the door, clutching the knife, her whole body vibrating with panic. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear anything else. Then the knocking started. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes squeezed shut, tears streaming down her face. "Tap, tap, tap. Go away," she whimpered. "Please, please, just go away." Silence. Her breath hitched. She leaned her head back against the door, shaking so hard she could barely hold on to the knife. Her chest rose and fell like a broken bellows. Her eyes stayed shut. "Please be gone. Please be gone." Then she heard it, breathing, on the other side of the door. Not soft, not shallow, deep, slow, heavy, right at her ear. Her heart felt like it had stopped completely. Her breath was barely a whisper. She squeezed her eyes tighter, lips trembling. "If you don't move, it won't see you. If you don't move, it won't see you." But then it spoke. No rasp, no hiss, no playful mockery. It whispered in a low, hollow voice so close to her ear, it felt like someone had leaned in against her cheek. "I'm inside now, Evie." Her eyes flew open. Her head snapped forward. She spun around, staring at the door, still closed, still locked. She backed away slowly, knife held in front of her, eyes wild, her chest rising and falling so fast she was lightheaded. "No," she whispered, backing toward the far wall. "No, you're not. You're not inside." Her back hit the wall. She clutched the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. No. Please, God, no. She turned her head slowly. The closet door, the one she hadn't checked. It was open. A face stared at her from the darkness inside. Pale, hollow-eyed, grinning. It didn't lunge. It didn't rush. It stepped out, slow, deliberate, one foot after the other. Her heart gave one final violent thud in her chest. Her mouth opened to scream, but no sound came out. Evangeline's scream finally broke free, a raw, guttural sound ripped from the deepest part of her soul. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She threw herself across the room, scrambling for the window. Her hands clawed at the lock, fingers slipping against the cold metal. Come on, please, please! Behind her she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Every step deliberate. It wasn't rushing. It didn't have to. "Where will you go, Evie?" The voice crooned softly. "There's nowhere to run." Her breathing was wild now, sharp, broken sobs mixed with gasping breaths. Her fingers finally found the lock, twisting it with a metallic click. She threw up the window, frigid night air rushing in like a slap to the face. Her eyes darted to the ground below, too far to jump, but there was no time. No time. Behind her, the footsteps stopped, right behind her. Her heart seized in her chest. She didn't have to turn to know it was there. She could feel it, that presence, that thick, suffocating weight of something that shouldn't exist. She squeezed her eyes shut, her whole body trembling. "Move! Just move!" She threw her leg over the windowsill, ready to climb out, fall if she had to, break a leg if she had to, anything to get away. But then something cold, so cold, brushed against the back of her neck. "Leaving already?" it whispered right in her ear. She screamed and kicked herself backward, her body twisting in midair as she half fell, half flung herself out the window. The world spun in a wild blur of grey and blue, and the ground hit her like a hammer. Pain shot through her ankle as she collapsed in a heap on the cold, wet dirt. Pain was good. Pain meant she was still alive. Her hands pressed into the dirt as she scrambled to her feet, her ankles screaming with every step. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her eyes locked on the tree line at the edge of the yard. The woods. Just get to the woods. It can't follow you there. It can't. She didn't know why she believed that, but she had to believe something. Her breath came in sharp, desperate bursts as she stumbled toward the tree line, her legs burning, her arms pumping. The cold air stung her lungs, her bare feet crunching on frostbitten grass and sharp twigs. She didn't look back. Don't look back. Don't look back. It's right behind you. But she heard it. That soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Not footsteps this time. Fingers. It wasn't walking anymore. It was crawling. Her throat clenched in a dry sob as she reached the edge of the woods. Branches scraped at her face, thorns tearing at her arms as she forced her way in. The dense canopy above snuffed out the moonlight, plunging everything into near darkness. Her breathing was a sharp, ragged wheeze, every inhale like swallowing broken glass. Behind her, the tapping sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't distant anymore. It was just behind her. She ducked under low branches, her fingers gripping tree trunks as she pulled herself forward. Her ankle throbbed with every step, but she didn't stop, didn't dare stop. Her heart was a wild drumbeat in her chest. She glanced over her shoulder just once. It was there, not running, not walking, crawling, its limbs bent at wrong angles, elbows and knees turned backward as it moved like a spider over the ground. Its head twisted unnaturally to face her, upside down, eyes locked on hers. It moved fast, too fast, its body jerking forward in bursts, like it was being yanked by invisible strings. "Don't run, Evie," it rasped, its hollow eyes never blinking. "Don't make me chase you." She ran harder, crashing through branches, barely able to see where she was going. Her arms were scratched, her feet torn from rocks and thorns. Her breath came in short, wild bursts like an animal caught in a snare. But she didn't stop. "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop." Somewhere in the woods she tripped. Her foot caught on a root, and she went down hard. Her head hit the dirt, her vision flashing white from the impact. For a second she didn't know where she was. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, hear her own breath wheezing in and out. Get up, now." Her hands clawed at the dirt as she dragged herself forward, her body shaking with exhaustion. Her vision swam, her ears ringing. Then it was there, right in front of her. Its face hovered just above the ground, inches from hers. Its grin was wider now, jagged teeth gleaming in the faint light filtering through the trees. Its hollow eyes were so close she could see her reflection in them, small, broken, terrified. "Tired, little Evie?" it whispered softly, tilting its head like a curious dog. "I can help you rest." Her scream was more like a broken sob as she swung wildly with her hands, dirt flying. It didn't flinch. Its head jerked forward so fast she barely saw it move, and suddenly it was right there, its face pressing so close to hers she felt its breath, cold and dry as autumn leaves. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. Its mouth didn't move, but she heard the words as clearly as if they were spoken into her mind. "But it's better this way. We missed you." Her fingers clawed at the ground, at the roots and leaves, her nails digging into the cold, wet earth. "Please," she whimpered. Her voice was so small, so weak. "Please, just let me go." It watched her for a moment. Its grin stayed fixed. Then, slowly, it leaned down until its mouth was right beside her ear. "You were mine the moment you opened that door," it whispered, its breath like frost against her skin. "And you did open it, Evie, didn't you?" Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind flashed back to last night. The lock had been open. She knew she'd locked it. She was sure she'd locked it. "Didn't you?" it said again, more insistent, the weight of those words pressing into her mind like a stone dropped in still water. Her body shook with silent sobs. She curled into herself, hands pressed over her ears, but it didn't help. The voice was already inside. It was always inside. "You should have stayed away from the dollhouse," it said, its voice like nails scratching the inside of her skull. "But you left it open, didn't you?" Her heart shattered, her mind cracked, and then the tapping started again. But this time it was inside her head. Tap, tap, tap. She opened her eyes slowly, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. She gazed up at the thing, hollow eyes staring into hers. She thought, for one brief, horrible moment, that maybe it was done with her, that maybe it would leave her alone. But it didn't leave. It leaned in closer, its face filling her entire vision, upside down and grinning. And then it said, so softly, so gently, "We're going to have so much fun, Evie." Her scream echoed through the woods, sharp and wild, but no one heard it. No one ever hears it. In the quiet that followed, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere, deep in the woods, came a soft, familiar sound. Tap, tap, tap.